I'd first like to introduce Ian Duhig, who's been based in Leeds for a number of years, and he's had fellowships at Leeds University, as well as Durham and Lancaster and many others. He also is the author of several collections of poetry, and his collection in 2016 was actually shortlisted for the T.S. Eliot Prize. One of the things I've noted about Ian is he's a mine of information about Leeds history, and I've had the pleasure of sharing, I think it was either the number 2 or the number 3 bus about a month ago, where he regaled me with stories about the different communities that coalesced in different parts of Leeds. So please give a very warm welcome to Ian Duhig.
An Arako for David Oluwale. Oluwale is Yoruba, for God has come home, but he came to find hell in God's own country. No home but cold Leeds streets or police cells, in his asylum only electroconvulsive therapy. Now, by the Aire, where David drowned fleeing policemen's boots, his feet light from hunger, my small nomadic cowrie garden grows for one who grown to be a shell of himself in this city. An empty cowrie is full as an egg with meanings. God's eyes, they make arakos, magic messages. Because Efa, Yoruba for 6, has the same letters as the word to draw. My 6 cowries set down here draw David's Christian ghost into Ocean's arms, water goddess with a name of water, that he might too step into the true meaning of his name, born back to Africa where the river of us all rose. This alchemy of cold fire on the Aire's earth makes nothing happen, like poetry, yet makes something from nothing for a man treated like he was nothing, making room to reflect on river water running softly. Thank you for listening to me.
Zaffar was born in Birmingham and currently resides in West Yorkshire. His first work appeared in the Faber New Poets series in 2014, and his recent collection, Us, was the poetry book Society Wildcard Choice for 2018. He's been a Wordsworth Trust Poet in Residence at Grasmere and a Burgess Fellow in Creative Writing at the University of Manchester. And this summer, I'm delighted to report he will join us here at the University of Leeds as our latest Douglas Castor Fellow in Poetry. Zaffar, the floor is yours.
How can you not be moved by this story? It seems such a kind of failure of humanity on so many levels. There's homelessness, there's horrible prejudice, there's mental health issues. It's a terrible story, and just on a personal level, my mum's white and English. My father is brown and Kashmiri from Pakistan. He lives there now. And I can just about remember a time when I was innocent about these things and just thought they were my parents. And I can remember the shocks, the 1,000 shocks actually, when you think, oh, they're being perceived differently. And my book, Us, is partly about that. And Ian mentioned in one of his poems, the river of us all. And I suppose the river has a real significance today. And my poem, Us, looks at the word us as a kind of space that holds wide waters. Us. If you ask me, us takes in undulations, each wave in the sea, all insides compressed, as if from one coast you could reach out to the next. And maybe it's a Midlands thing, but when I was young, us equally meant me, says the one, or you, tell us where you're from. And the way football fans share one fate, I, being one, am Liverpool, no less, cresting the Mexican wave of we or us. a shore-like state, two places at once. God knows what's in it. And at opposite ends, my heart sunk at separations of us. When it comes to us, colour me unsure. Something in me, or it, has failed the course. I'd love to think I could stretch to it, us, but the waves therein are too wide for words. I hope you get here where I'm coming from. I hope you're with me on this, between love and loss, where I'd give myself away, stranded as if the universe is a matter of one stress, us. I hope from here on I can say it, and though far-fetched, it won't be too far wrong. I mean, it's horrible to pick out things in the story, but because everything about the story of Oluwale is so sad, I think. But yeah, the one thing that really stuck in my mind in a horrible way was seeing how the police in some of their reports had put his nationality down as, and I'm sorry to say this, but as WOG. So nationality : WOG, which is just, awful. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Zaffar. It's now my pleasure to introduce Jackie Kay. Many of us as readers will have delighted in her many books, which include the memoir Red Dust Road, includes Trumpet, her novel, includes many short stories, and her most recent collection, Bantam. The other aspect as well is her teaching. She's Professor of Creative Writing at the University of Newcastle, but has also taught on many programs and courses. For me, as someone who's really interested in spoken word, I first heard Jackie Kay on the radio many years ago, and I always delight in hearing her. I think with spoken word, we often see it as that very kind of performative poetry that's kind of on stage. But for me, the aspect of someone using spoken word in terms of orality, in terms of being able to give a good account, not just of themselves, but also of others, I think is a great gift and something I see very much in Jackie's work. The kind of generosity she has in her fairly recent role as a Scottish Macker, in terms of her kind of enthusing people with poetry and going out and about and meeting and engaging with people through generosity, I think is something that we're looking at now with regards to David Oluwale being repressed, not having voice, not being able to give voice. And to me, that's almost like the antidote. And we need more of it. So please give a very warm welcome to Jackie Kay.
Thank you. I'm here not just because Ian asked me, but also because David Oluwale means a lot to me, being half Nigerian. I feel like he's my brother, and I feel a great affinity with him. And I can't really imagine anything worse to be homeless and also to be persecuted both at the same time, and to have mental health problems. We each in our lives have different problems and different things that we face with different times, from bereavements to shocks to broken hearts. But when things collide and when things seem to all come at once, that's when we feel like we've really got to take a grip and hang on to ourselves in a certain way. This one is really about somebody who's suffering mental health problems, affinity. It was because I was high yesterday that I had to come doon the day. That's the way of it. 1 minute you're all smiley, killing yourself. Next you're killing yourself, greeting like a big burden, salty tears pouring down your cheeks in the rain. You're sinking and you try and say yin and yang. You try and say it's no that black and white. It's all the in-betweens. But at night, you curry down and wait for the morning. But it doesn't come ony time soon. But one thing, you're no alane, Ken. Others hear the same thing in the swing. Thank you very much.
We all benefit from being humane, and and you can see, when I hear Jackie, I always think I see how humane her parents are and were in her. And it comes across in your warmth and everything else. And I don't know where I'm going with this, but but we all benefit from being humane to the other. It's this idea of us being a divided and very small thing only makes us feel smaller.
There's a whole area of mental ill health where poetry is effective in different ways. When I was hard to work with autistic people a while ago, one of the things which was a bit of a gift for me was that if you wanted to be listened to by a person who was suffering from autism, if you said the information, you might be ignored. If you sang it, it wouldn't be forgotten. I was fascinated by the extraordinary abilities in terms of memory by some people suffering from autism, but also the physical relationship they had with the poetry we were looking at. We often talk about dance. Collingwood, I mentioned Collingwood, but dance, when I was holding a child earlier on, you move, you have poems that reflect movement with children. And all of these things, so everything from the most physical contact you have with another person through to the most abstruse intellectual relationships you may have. Poetry is all the way along that spectrum, and poetry is, even if it's an act by solitary people, it is a social act. You are reaching out to other people in it, and that's why I think it's perfectly adapted to it.
Hi there, thank you for your poetry. I wanted to know if you could say anything to David Oluwale, what would you say?
Sorry.
I would say you're not alone. He's really not alone, and I mean that in the best of senses, but also in the worst, in the sense that there's been lots and lots of deaths, unfortunately, in this country and in the world through the result of police brutality, which is why we've got a Black Lives Matter movement in America and one in this country, which isn't actually as well known. And there's been so many different really dreadful deaths, but people remember. We part of us being a society that cares is the responsibility not just to name but to remember our dead. And there's been extraordinary books of poetry recently, one by Danez, who wrote a book actually imagining that all the black people that had been killed at the hands of police brutality had all been brought back to life. And in a way that be something like, I'd want to say something like that to him, that he was not alone and that he was coming back, that he was constantly returning, because traumatic deaths bring with them a kind of a returning.
I think, it is, you'd have to be quite terribly apologetic, but he has given birth to the most extraordinary cultural afterlife. I got badly sunburned last summer looking at King David marching through the streets of Chapeltown, attended by an entourage of migrant masqueraders. He's inspired poetry and art, the exhibition I mentioned earlier at the Tetley. I could say you endured horrors, but you never knew the beauty you gave birth to. You've lived long after. You don't know how long you live. You don't know what you brought into people's lives. You can't possibly make up for what he endured. But he was a focus and generated goodwill and beauty and love for generations afterward. It's an extraordinary thing for a person who was regarded as nothing in his life to be able to do. What a message.
Hi. This question's for Zav specifically, I think. So in the past 20 years, we've seen a lot of demonization of Arab Muslim men, which means writing poetry is it's a revolutionary act. It kind of defies what the corporate media in America and Britain would suggest an Arab Muslim man or someone from an Arab Muslim background would be like. And I was wondering how, for you as a writer, you interact with that identity which is assigned to you? Do you feel like you are constantly trapped in this kind of writer of colour rather than just being considered a writer? Are you always going to be the revolutionary writer who's breaking a stereotype, or can you be considered a writer amongst many?
I think we all think about these things, but yeah, like when I have the first poem in my book is about cricket, and whenever I say I've got a cricket poem, people always think it's going to be about whether I support Pakistan or England, and it's not. It's about losing the ball in the bushes and thinking about time and space and things. And by the way, I do support Pakistan, but I didn't write about that. But no. So sometimes it, like you were saying about being seen as Arab, I get seen as sometimes Middle Eastern. I was talking to a chap from Iraq, and he was sure I was from his, and I like that. I really like that. I people can think that I'm from where they are from. But sometimes it happens when you're not expecting it, and where you're kind of profiled, and that sometimes you want to write into that, but sometimes you also want to write away from that as well. And maybe that's why I wanted to read about the butterfly poems, because it felt like it was so far away from the subject of identity in a way, but it's also identity as well, because to write a poem you have to identify with something. You have to. There's a wonderful Japanese poet called Issa, a haiku poet, and he often wrote about tiny insects coming into his house, and he welcomes them into the house, and little mosquito, I hope my little house is okay for you, and I love all that, and he's not a Japanese man while he's writing that. He's an insect or something, and that's wonderful, and poetry can give us that, and it can also be a way of answering back, and my us poem, I suppose, answers back some of those wounds when I've heard people say us, and only one of my parents was in their us. And but also, you think about that a lot, don't you? So writing into, but also away from identity. And
I think it's hard to be able to be your complex self, and one of the things that life kind of tries to teach us is to be able to be all of ourselves. I remember meeting the African American poet Audre Lorde, and she said to me at quite a young age, Jackie, you can be black and Scottish. You don't have to choose. And it was quite a radical thing to be, for her to say at that time, and it was really exciting to me, the idea that I didn't have to choose, and I suppose I've written from that vantage point ever since, of being, welcome our complex selves, because people will always try and reduce you or make you into a series of different small labels, and sometimes it will seem like your own writing will box you in, and you just got to keep on trying to play a kind of magician's trick of getting out of the different boxes, and seeing that there's a big wide world out there, and try to embrace the complexity that is yourself as much as you can, because people will always try and reduce you. They always will, and that's how it is, I remember being in a pub one time in London, and this woman saying to me, "You can't sit doing that chair, that's my chair." And I said to her, "Oh, you're from Glasgow, aren't you?" And she went, "Aye, how did you know that?" I said, "I'm from Glasgow myself." She went, "You're not, are you?" No, I said, "I'm psychic." No, I said, "I'm from Glasgow myself." She went, "You're not, are you? A foreign-looking bugger." And she just come right out. There was a kind of a relief in her just coming right out. There's a relief sometimes in people coming right out and saying things in a way. I could actually keep you here all night telling you a whole load of these stories. Actually, I'll just tell you one more. I was in a shop in a place in Scotland called Drimmen, but it's spelt dry men. Lots of dry men about in Drimmen. And I was trying on this top, and my mum said, "That suits you." This complete stranger came up to me and she said, "I think that colour suits you too, dear." where are you from? So I said, I'm from Glasgow. And she went, is that right? Because I've got a friend from the Dominican Republic. My son had that made in a T-shirt for me. It said, I've got a friend from the Dominican Republic on the front, and on the back it said, what have you got?
This is a question probably for Melanie. You just spoke about a statistic, which I've kind of looked at in the past as well. You said black men are 9 times more likely to kind of go into mental health institutions. And I just wanted to ask you to kind of explore the reasons around this, or what you found in your research.
Well, the whole idea was that the mental health system were diagnosing black men of African and Caribbean origin 9 times more than their white counterparts. But the problematics around that was that there were forms of misdiagnoses, there were forms of labelling. So, for example, in the 80s, a term came through called Rastafrenia, which was actually attributed to Rastafarians who suffered from mental illness. And there was also another term called ganja psychosis, which was also, looking at the kind of aspects of being kind of having almost like black men having a predilection for ganja that would lead to forms of mental illness. And for me, it's atrocious labelling, it's racism, and it's a number of other aspects of, singling out and selection, which doesn't really lend itself to the mental health system. And the guy at the top who was talking about looking at alternative ways of how we diagnose, but also how we care for people. That's kind of what I'm more interested in. I'm interested in not the labels and kind of the marginalisation of particular groups, but how we can actually acknowledge that mental health and mental well-being and mental illness is part of our everyday lives and is something that we often experience, if not ourselves, but within our families. And if we were to look at it outside of the stigma and outside of othering, we would be able to tackle it and not just rely on the mental health system and the way that they label it for us. So that's kind of that's why I researched it, because I was deeply disturbed by the statistic, not because I wanted to encourage it. And I've ended up working in the arts and particularly in literature, and I've ended up having a very strong relationship with Jean Bintabreeze, who has been labelled as schizophrenic for several decades, but is many, many things, as Jackie Kay talks about, being our complex selves. She's not first and foremost a schizophrenic. She happens to be a number of different things, and she happens to live with schizophrenia, and she happens to be a fantastic poet and a fantastic orator and a fantastic, person, possibly because of and not, and in spite of schizophrenia. So I'm kind of interested in that.
Have you got time for one more question? I'm just interested in, I was just thinking about the 2 eras that we're in from 50 years ago and what poetry was like and what poetry was being influenced by, where we are now. To what extent is this era of Brexit and national conflict, let's say, constraining and also liberating your poetry?
I think it was actually Jackie who said on a course a long time ago that it's like art is one of the areas where when you give yourself constraints, you liberate something. I'm thinking about like a Kunial and obviously Oulipo and things like this, but even the restraints of a sonnet. I think it was Yeats was asked, where did he get, his wonderful cosmic ideas from? After he published The Vision, he said, looking for my next rhyme. And it's true. If you do, anybody who's ever written any formal verse, you can't be a control freak and write formal verse. You've got to let it take you where it goes, And the fact that we've got all of these things to write about now, it's more material. It sounds terrible. It sounds ghoulish, but we will be processing what this country is doing to itself for a long time to come. And poets are well placed to look at a torn society and torn language.
With Brexit and everything, with poetry feels like the only place I feel at home sometimes, but when I feel like I've got words vaguely as I wanted to, and a lot of poets don't feel particularly at home in one way or another, which is why David Oluwale's story is so moving, because there's that additional element of homelessness but words is one place where I feel like, my thoughts at least can be at home, and I suppose the whole Brexit thing kind of concentrates that, and the whole idea of us, I suppose, has this other currency, so if I stand up and say I've got a poem called Us, it has this, I don't have to say the word Brexit or anything, or who are we, and yeah.
One observation about Brexit is I worked with a huge variety of groups in the past couple of years, both with the C group, obviously, different Muslim groups. We were talking about Islam. I worked on an Islamophobia project with Ahmed Keisha's fantastic River Aire Festival, Leeds Irish Health and Homes, and other special projects as well. They all thought Brexit was a disaster, except we were doing films at the Crypt, street homeless, people with nothing. We showed John Smith's film about Brexit, Who Are We? And a really nasty atmosphere developed very quickly. I talked about Italy, where Rashid came from. It's Casa Pound. This is a poet's name, attaches itself to this fascist movement. But right-wing groups in Poland, and indeed the Polish fascist group are active over here, it's a sort of weaponized compassion. We will look after our needy. A society is stripped out of its budgets and possibilities to care for people. Who will step into that will be very ugly people indeed, and they started doing that. And it was extraordinary that the people who had, it was as if you think you're being neglected, which they are. Homelessness is terrible. People are dying on the streets in numbers that we haven't seen before. And yet they think they are being neglected, not by the people in Westminster who were doing the neglecting, but this remote. I feel in some way, if you're going to vote against uncaring governments, if that's what Brexit meant, that it's a comprehensible vote, but they were voting against the wrong uncaring governments. But that's what we've got to look at. I think that's part of the importance of working in communities, is communities will be vulnerable now. We need to protect communities as well as make contact with them for do-gooder reasons. It's a dangerous time, I fear. I was thinking about casual labourers everywhere, really, the casual labourers who came here. David Oluwale, who came and did casual work. And this is a different kind of a one. This is the Lama tiling. After the fair, I had still a light heart and a heavy purse. He struck so cheap, and cattle doted on him. In his time, mine only dropped heifers, fat as cream. Yields doubled. I grew fond of company that knew when to shut up. Then one night, disturbed from dreams of my dear late wife, I hunted down her torn voice to his pale form, stock still in the light from the dark lantern. Stark naked, but for the foxtrot biting his ankle, I knew him a warlock, a cow with leather horns. To go into the hair get you muckle sorrow, the wisdom runs muckle care. I levelled and blew the small hour through his heart. The moon came out. By its yellow witness I saw him fur over like a stone mossing. His lovely head thinned, his top lip gathered, his eyes rose like bread. I carried him in a sack that grew lighter at every step and dropped him from a bridge. There was no splash. Now my herd's elf-shot. I don't dream, but spend my nights casting ball from half-crowns and my days here. Bless me, Father, I have sinned. It has been an hour since my last confession. Thank you.
There is no dictionary for my father's language. His dialect, for a start, is difficult to name. Even this taxi driver who talks it lacks the knowledge. Some say it's Pahari, hill speak. Others Patwari or Pahari Patwari, too earthy and scriptless to find a home in books. This mountain speech is a low language, ours. No good, you must learn speak Urdu. I'm getting the runaround. Whatever it is, this talk or script did once have a script, Landa, in the reign of the Buddhists. So was Dad's speech some kind of Dogri? Is it Mirpuri, Kashmiri? The differences are lost on me. I'm told it's part way towards Punjabi, but what that tongue would call Dorda, Dad would agree was Dosana, yours. Truly, though there are many dictionaries for the tongue I speak, it's the close-by things I'm lost to say. Things as pulsed and present as the back of this hand. Never mind stumbling towards some higher plane. And either way, even at the rare moment I get towards, or, thank God, even getting to my point, I can't put into words where I've arrived. Thank you.
It's been an amazing night being here with Ian and Zaff and with all of you. Been a really wonderful audience, haven't they been fantastic? I think we should clap for you. Some of you clapped yourselves, that's good. I thought I'd finish with a poem that I wrote for Julia Darling, the poet that I mentioned earlier, who was a dear friend of mine and died 15 years or so ago. And she would be with us here in spirit too. So bringing her back into the room and also remembering David with the end. Darling, you might forget the exact sound of her voice or how her face looked when sleeping. You might forget the sound of her quiet weeping, curled into the shape of a half moon. When smaller than herself, she seemed already to be leaving before she left, when the blossom was on the trees and the sun was out and all seemed good in the world. I held her hand and sang a song from when I was a girl. Heel ya ho, boys. Let her go, boys. And when I stopped singing, she had slipped away, already a slip of a girl again, skipping off, her heart light, her face almost smiling. And what I didn't know or couldn't say then was that she hadn't really gone. The dead don't go till you do, loved ones. The dead are still here, holding our hands.
Thank you very much for your questions. Thank you for your generosity as an audience. It's been a wonderful evening. I'd like to thank the authors, but firstly, please let's thank the David Oluwale Memorial Association for putting this event on and this series of events this week. But what I'd like to do is for us to give a very warm welcome to the generosity of the poets we've had this evening. So please thank Ian, Zaffar and Jackie. Thank you very much.